Ecosystem engineers are plants and animals that shape the habitats around them. For example, trees build the homes for bugs, birds, lizards, microbes, as well as cast shade on the ground for other bottom-dwelling creatures. Beavers actively build dams, which turn rivers into lakes that host aquatic life. The structures that ecosystem engineers create can form cool and interesting patterns. Ecosystem engineers like trees don't necessarily decide to form these patterns. They disperse via their seeds being blown in the wind or eaten and transported by other animals. On the other hand, beavers are more purposeful engineers, since they get to move around and choose where they build their structures. This is how we would distinguish between active and passive engineers. Corals are also ecosystem engineers. The reefs that they build support the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. We see crazy patterns in coral reefs, such as these fractal bucket formations, reticulate shapes, and spurs and grooves. The spurs are coral ridges separated by the grooves in between them. The way that these structures channel water make them nature's front line in storm protection on coastlines. What's interesting is that we find these formations in many reefs around the world. That begs the question, is their formation simply controlled by their environment, or do the corals play more of a role in the design?
Now, to understand this, we need to know what controls where corals live and grow. Corals are somewhat picky animals. We only find them around certain latitudes of the world. So there's a few main things that control where a coral will live. They need the temperature to be right, they need enough light to photosynthesize, the water needs to be the right salinity, they need enough but not too many nutrients, and there needs to be enough aragonite dissolved in the water for them to build their skeletons. But how does an individual coral end up where it does? Now, corals start their lives as tiny little larvae. When they adventure out into the water column, they have very little control over where they can go. These guys only swim at about 5 millimeters per second, so they pretty much end up where the water takes them. Now, when these guys grab onto the reef, they can only hold on so tight. So when the water's moving too fast, they get blown away. So it turns out the adult corals can actually help with this. Their complex three-dimensional structures slow the water around them by creating microturbulence that may be essential for new recruitment. This suggests that corals are more likely to settle and grow around other corals, and less likely to grow out on their own. This is precisely the impact that hydrodynamics has on coral structure formation. But what does this mean for spur and grooves? Well, let's look at some examples in nature.
There are a few hints in the spur and grooves around One Tree Reef which suggest how they might form. The largest grooves are those forming facing the direction of wave impact, which is the eastern side of One Tree Reef. This trend is more evident on reefs that are more exposed to wave energy, and the more protected reefs tend to have shorter grooves. So we thought it was pretty clear that wave energy had something to do with these structures. Moreover, spurs appear to prefer shallower slopes over steeper ones, which you can see from this diagram, where there are more grooves on the green parts and not so much on the red. Where the seafloor gets too steep, the grooves tend to disappear. Moreover, 93% of grooves grow on surfaces that are shallower than 5 degrees. Maybe this has something to do with the wave energy interacting with the slope. So we've set out to answer, to what extent can hydrodynamics explain the preferential formation of spurs and grooves on shallower slopes?
We want to understand how fluid moves through these structures and how that is affected by the seafloor slope. If we could produce a model that shows stronger preferential colonization of spurs over grooves on shallower slopes, it would support our hypothesis that hydrodynamics drives spur and groove formation. We went to our engineering friends to make a numerical model of this.
In essence, numerical modeling is just the use of mathematical formulas and relationships to sort of replicate real-world phenomena. So based on the dimensions of the coral and spurs like you supplied us, we've come up with two geometries, one with 1 degree gradient and the other 5 degrees. In terms of the wave is 1.5 meters in height and 9 meters in length. And we've looked to find the wall shear stresses on the surface of the spurs and grooves as our output.
Now, this shear stress that we're measuring is essentially the force that the water applies onto the reef to rip things off of it. Now, we know from the literature that a shear stress of 1.6 pascals is enough to rip and dislodge a little coral larvae that's settled on the reef. So this is our model output. Any region in red exceeds that critical 1.6 pascals to dislodge. So we can assume that this area is uninhabitable for coral. As you can see, there is sort of a greater red region along the edges of the spurs near the grooves, but this is not quite what we're expecting to see. To support our hypothesis, we really expected to see a large portion of the groove uninhabitable and a large portion of the spur habitable. When we do the math though, about 20% of the groove is uninhabitable, while 25% of the spur is uninhabitable. This is especially unexpected, because we added a rugosity value to our spurs, so we should expect to see less shear stress on our spurs compared to the grooves. You can see that there's a lot of shear stress building up at the back of the spur, and that's probably skewing things. You can really see the effect of this with our velocity chart and how it builds up there. Also, we're not actually seeing any shear stress occurring inside of the grooves.
From the results, it seems that the waves sort of must react with the surface to produce these shear stresses above the threshold. But in saying this, water depth in the groove is 1.5 meters deeper compared to its surroundings. So we are likely seeing less turbulent mixing induced by the waves at the base of the grooves.
So essentially, our model's not really showing us any turbulence going on in those grooves in that 1 degree model, and this means there's no shear stress in the grooves. We also see the same thing happen to a more extreme in our 5 degree model. In this one, we're not actually seeing very much hydrodynamic forces going on at all. This could suggest that at steeper gradients, hydrodynamics does not very well explain the formations of these structures. If we assume that hydrodynamics is the primary driver of why these spurs and grooves form, then our model suggests that we would be less likely to find spurs and grooves forming at steeper gradients. So in some way, this supports our hypothesis. But our results aren't exactly conclusive.
Needless to say, the shear stress desertion model does not completely explain why spurs and grooves exist. But our engineers ran a different kind of model. We need to look at not only where they are blown away from, but also where they are able to settle.
We had 50,000 larvae released into the model. Basically, if larvae came into contact with either the spur or a groove, they were considered settled, unless acted upon by a shear force greater than the threshold, in which then it will be reintroduced into the flow.
These seem to fit our hypothesis a lot more closely. 9,936 particles stuck to the spur, and 0 stuck to the groove. However, we weren't able to get this to work for the different sloped models, so we can't totally use this as evidence.
So our model doesn't explain exactly what we see in nature. However, it does show that hydrodynamics has a role in forming these patterns, as it did demonstrate the lack of structure formation on the steeper slopes. So in the future, investigating the combined effect of settlement and erosion patterns seems to be the way to go. In all likelihood, corals are neither trees nor beavers, but a hybrid that lives where it does because of a mix of environmental forcing and its own autonomy.
Thanks for watching!